Okay. Good morning, fellow Toastmasters. So, as much as I enjoy engineering, I've always had an interest in the financial markets. And as an offshoot of that, I came across the topic of currency. And that piqued a very strong interest and ended up being the foundation of today's speech. I hope you all find this interesting. So, one of the first systems humans used to trade was the barter system. And in the barter system, its main currency was livestock. Unfortunately, this wasn't a long lived solution, predominantly due to two reasons. Number one is what economists call the coincidence of wants. That is the idea that you meet someone who has something you want, who in turn wants something you have at the same place in the same time. It's extremely unlikely. Number two is problems with divisibility. So the idea that one cow might not equal one pig, and the inability to produce change from that transaction was another reason for its downfall. Humans then moved on to using commodity currencies like seashells and tea bricks for trading. Again, this was not a feasible solution, mainly because these items weren't durable enough. Shooting forward, the first forms of money were actually seen in Athens, Greece in around 680 BC in the forms of gold and silver. I use the term money in opposition to currency mainly because there's a key difference between the two. Don't get me wrong, they do have very similar characteristics. For instance, they're both durable, they're portable, they're divisible, they're fungible. The idea that one unit of currency or money I own would be equal to one unit of currency or money you own. But the main difference is that money, so like silver and that's gold, is a store of value and it doesn't lose its purchasing power over time. Whereas currency, so like paper currency, like the dollar, has no intrinsic value. But the dollar did have a purpose back in the day. It was a claim check to gold. So the idea was you'd go to a bank, you'd cash in all your currency, and you'd get gold in return. Pre-World War One, this set exchange rate was called the classical gold standard. And under the gold standard, banks were required to have a 100% reserve ratio. So that's the idea that banks had to have an equivalent amount of gold to whatever currency that they put out in circulation. So they had to have enough gold to back up the currency they put out. Then 1918 and 1914, World War One hits. This standard is halted and the gold and silver reserves are used to finance the war effort. Post World War One, this standard is supplanted by the gold exchange standard, which is pretty much the same thing, except banks were allowed to have a 40% reserve ratio. So 40% in gold or whatever currency that they put out in circulation. This ended up not turning out too well just because the US was spending tons of currency and not having enough gold to back it up with. So this is from 1918 to 1939. 1939, World War II occurs. Same thing happens, this standard is halted and more reserves are used to finance the war effort. Then in 1944, at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, a bunch of the warring nations got together and they came up with the Bretton Woods standard, which saw the world's currencies being pegged to the dollar, which would in turn be backed by gold. When I say pegged, I mean there'd be multiple fixed exchange rates between the world's currencies and the dollar. And under this standard, there was no reserve ratio specified. So banks were not required to have any amount of gold to whatever currency they put out in circulation. And with the US spending enormous amounts of currency, this is during the time when they were fighting both the Vietnam and the Korean Wars, and they kept incurring all this debt. And it got to the point where Nixon in 1971 decided to unpeg the dollar from gold. Shortly afterwards, the world's currencies unpegged themselves from the dollar. And this is exactly what we see today, a bunch of floating currencies that fluctuate on a daily basis depending on market demand. Fiat currencies haven't really stood the test of time. They normally last about 40 to 50 years. And in our constitution, our forefathers actually mentioned that the legal tender should always be gold and silver, as opposed to currency, which can be printed in vast amounts. And with the current situation, today we see the Fed printing in trillions and trillions of dollars all the time. So who knows where we'll end up. That's some food for thought, and that's really all I had. I Hope you all enjoyed listening to this as much as I enjoyed giving it. Thank you.